Chloe Lewis had already pinned the ivory ribbon to her bodice when she understood that the choice was no longer a choice, only a posture she would be required to hold for an entire evening. Straight-backed, useful, silent, while the man she had once married beneath a cracked chapel window stood in another room preparing to marry her half-sister under chandeliers and fresh flowers. The ribbon had been selected to match the bride's gloves. It also matched the paper labels tied to storage trunks in Arabella Lewis's cellar, where every life in the household seemed to have been catalogued, priced, and stacked. The maid finishing Chloe's hair kept her eyes lowered, as if she had been instructed not to notice the trembling in Chloe's hands. Chloe steadied them on the dressing table until the tremor passed. She did not ask for lavender water, though the scent of hot tongs and face powder had begun to turn the room close and breathless. She did not ask for a chair. The mirror showed a woman arranged for ceremony. Smooth coil of dark hair, pearl pins borrowed from her mother's case. A gown elegant enough to imply affection, and plain enough to avoid confusion with the bride. Useful, but replaceable. That had always been the measure. When Arabella entered, the room shifted around her with the quick obedience of staff who had learned to hear command in the softest syllable. Her gown was silver grey, cut with expensive restraint, and the old sapphire at her throat caught the candlelight with the hard gleam of ice. She looked once at Chloe, once at the ribbon, and moved to adjust the fold of fabric near Chloe's shoulder, as if correcting a ledger column. "You will stand at Helena's left," she said. "You will carry the second bouquet until the vicar asks for the exchange. You will answer if spoken to. You will not volunteer recollections." The maid pretended to be occupied with hairpins. Chloe watched her own face in the mirror rather than her mother's. "As you wish." Arabella's hand rested for a moment on the back of the chair, ringed fingers still. "This family has worked very hard to secure a respectable match for your sister. You understand what that requires." Chloe understood too much. 3 weeks earlier she had been sent to Arabella's study after supper and made to sit while her mother opened a leather dispatch case, unfolded promissory notes, and laid them side by side upon the blotter, with the composure of a hostess arranging place cards. The notes carried her brother Thomas's signature, earnest and disastrous. Ink spread where his hand had shaken. Interest upon interest had swollen the debt beyond the reach of wages. The creditors had agreed to delay only because Arabella had guaranteed payment and taken possession of the papers. Arabella never raised her voice when she explained consequences. "Your brother's future depends upon prudent behavior," she had said that night. "Scandal is expensive. Silence is not." Now, in the dressing room, she repeated none of this. She did not need to. Leverage was most efficient when it remained implied. She reached for Chloe's left wrist, turned it, and checked that the old gold bangles were absent. "Good," she said. "Those provincial things would have looked sentimental." They had been part of Chloe's trousseau 3 years before, when she had still believed a narrow chapel and 2 signatures could shelter a life from interference. They were gone now, like the chapel name in the parish index, and the surname her husband had given the vicar on that bright, wind-swept afternoon. "Adrian Vale," he had said then, with a smile that transformed his restrained face into something almost young. A simple ceremony, he had promised, a necessary secrecy, just for a while. She had believed him because she had wanted to believe what his eyes offered: fatigue, caution, and the kind of attention that did not flatter. Arabella turned towards the door. "The guests are arriving." The ballroom below had been remade for celebration in the language of money. Mirrored sconces newly polished, white roses imported despite season, musicians from Bath installed behind a screen of palms. The windows were unlatched to release the heat of so many bodies, and night air crossed the room in light draughts, carrying candle smoke and damp stone from the terrace. Chloe descended the staircase with Helena on her arm, feeling every eye pause and move on. Helena glowed in cream silk and lace, fair hair dressed high beneath a wreath of orange blossom. She was 19, lively, eager, and still unpracticed in cruelty. That was not innocence, Chloe thought. It was protection. At the foot of the stairs, guests bowed over Helena's hand and offered the same polished phrases about beauty, fortune, and happiness. For Chloe, there were smaller greetings, each one wrapped in social condescension so neat it could have passed for kindness. "The practical sister," murmured Lady Penford to her companion, not quietly enough. "Miss Lewis manages the household details," came the reply. "Useful. Replaceable." Helena squeezed Chloe's fingers once before being drawn away by a tide of congratulations. "Do not leave me," she whispered with real fear beneath the bridal brightness. "I shall be near," Chloe said. That, at least, was true. She would be near the altar, near the vows, near the deliberate reordering of her own history, and she would not move unless moving became the only way to keep from vanishing entirely. Dinner progressed in the long, measured course expected of such evenings. Each dish announced by footmen, each seating position calibrated to reinforce rank and alliance. Chloe had been placed midway down the right side of the table between a widowed colonel who spoke only of horseflesh and a clergyman's wife who asked, with bright curiosity, whether Chloe intended to travel to Bath after the wedding now, that domestic duties would no longer require so much of her. Chloe answered politely, cutting pheasant into careful portions she could not taste. At the head of the table, Arabella presided without visible effort. She directed servants with a glance. She corrected a misplaced decanter with a fingertip. She kept Helena laughing, the solicitors flattered, and the future in orderly columns behind her eyes. Across from Arabella sat the groom, Captain Adrian Vale, in dark evening coat with the posture of a man trained to occupy less space than his authority might permit. He listened more than he spoke. When addressed directly, he answered in short, precise lines that revealed nothing and conceded less. Chloe had trained herself not to look at him for longer than courtesy required. The discipline held until the toasts began. Crystal chimed against crystal. Chairs shifted. A hush spread from the head of the table toward the far ends like fabric being drawn smooth across a bed. Adrian rose with his glass. Candlelight struck his right hand, and she saw it. The pale scar crossing the base of his thumb in a clean diagonal line, exactly where a broken strap buckle had sliced him on a wet morning 3 years earlier. She had torn her petticoat hem for a bandage because no surgeon had been near, and he had laughed softly at the impracticality of silk for field medicine. "You always improvise," he had said. The memory landed with the force of impact. Not imagined, not mistaken. The scar proved what his name had denied. He thanked their hosts with formal grace. He praised Helena with due tenderness. He spoke of new beginnings and family concord and duty undertaken with humility. Then, as if adding an incidental note no one at the table would remember by midnight, he said, "I remain grateful to Mrs. Lewis for rescuing me from an unfortunate youthful entanglement and guiding me toward a more suitable course." Laughter fluttered down the table, delicate and approving. Someone remarked that all men had a youthful entanglement to outgrow. Arabella inclined her head with modesty so polished it looked like virtue. Chloe felt the stem of her glass press into her palm until the edge hurt. She did not lower her eyes. She did not let the pain alter her expression. Across the table, Adrian raised his glass in her direction for the briefest fraction of a second. Not enough for anyone else to see as signal. enough for her to understand that the line had been placed like a chess piece, public, deniable, and aimed directly at the only person in the room who could contradict it. He had called their marriage an entanglement, or he had called it that for the room while telling her that he remembered every detail she had tried to bury in order to survive this house. Helena leaned toward Chloe as the applause swelled. "You are pale. Are you unwell?" Chloe set down her glass before the tremor reached her wrist. "I'm quite well." The answer was a lie. It was also a necessity. Around them, the room resumed its easy current of voices, silverware, and carefully managed futures. Arabella was already speaking to the solicitor on her left, discussing tomorrow's procession order with the same tone she used for linen inventories and schoolroom accounts. Nothing in her face suggested uncertainty. She believed the evening was in hand. She believed her daughter's silence could be counted upon because it had been purchased in debt paper and habit. Chloe sat through the final course, hearing almost nothing, the old chapel rising in her mind with unwanted clarity. Rough wooden pews, a draught through warped panes, Adrian's hand warm over hers as they signed, both names written plainly in the register while the vicar sanded the wet ink. Legal, binding, real. A life begun without permission, and now being methodically erased in a ballroom full of witnesses. When dinner broke and guests drifted toward cards and music, Arabella approached her near the mantel with a smile meant for observers. "You have done tolerably," she said, low enough to remain private. "Continue to do so, and Thomas will have no difficulties this quarter." Chloe met her mother's gaze and inclined her head. The sapphire at Arabella's throat flashed once as she turned away, already summoning a footman, already directing the next movement of the night. Chloe stood where she had been placed, bouquet in hand, breathing the mixed scents of wax and roses and wine, and understood with a calm so cold it steadied her that obedience would not protect anyone for long. Not her brother, not Helena, not herself. But for this night, until she knew where the next step would land, silence remained the only coin she possessed, and she spent it with her spine unbent. Chloe stood where she had been placed until the last of the applause thinned into smaller currents of conversation, then moved when movement was expected of her, and not one breath sooner. A footman approached to ask whether the bride's bouquet should be returned to the withdrawing room or kept near the pianoforte for the songs that would follow. Chloe answered, took the flowers herself, and crossed the ballroom through pockets of laughter that parted for Helena and closed again around everyone else. She felt Arabella's system working with the quiet efficiency of clockwork. Guests amused, alliances warmed, servants redirected, daughters assigned their proper uses. Helena found her in the withdrawing room, flushed from congratulations and too tightly laced to sit without care. "Stay with me while they sing," she said, fingers already reaching for Chloe's sleeve. "Mama says I must appear serene. I fear I look hunted." "You look admired," Chloe replied, easing Helena into a chair and lifting the lace at her throat by a fraction so she could breathe. "There is a difference," Helena laughed, then lowered her voice. "Does he seem kind to you?" The question landed like a stone dropped into deep water. No splash, only widening circles. Chloe folded the bouquet ribbon once around her palm, loosened it, and kept her tone even. "He seems controlled." "That is not an answer. It is the one I have." Helena studied her face with the frankness of youth, searching for a reassurance Chloe could not manufacture, then accepted what she had been given because the room was filling and she had no private life left tonight. Arabella entered with 2 matrons and a list of tomorrow's timings, spoke Helena's name with polished affection, and spoke Chloe's without looking at her. "Miss Lewis will remain to settle the gift registry and the musician's fee. Helena, come. Lady Penford wishes to see the veil in better light. Chloe curtsied to the ladies, waited for them to leave, and went to the small escritoire by the fire where receipts had been stacked in neat, merciless piles. The columns were already ruled in Arabella's hand: flowers, wine, hired plate, church stipend, transport, gratuities. Chloe copied figures into the household ledger with a steel nib that caught at rough paper fibres. Her life had narrowed to this kind of precision long before tonight. Additions that balanced, names entered in the right line, errors corrected before anyone asked who had made them. When the musicians were dismissed and the last carriage rolled from the courtyard, she climbed to the schoolroom with a candelabrum, and the accounts bound against her chest. The schoolroom had once held maps and French primers. Now it held locked cabinets, correspondence files, and Arabella's secondary desk, where domestic governance merged with social strategy and never acknowledged the seam. Chloe unpinned her hair, shook the ache from her hands, and finished tallying the evening's expenses while the wax burned low. At the edge of the blotter lay Thomas's last letter, unopened because Arabella had said it contained nothing operationally useful. Chloe did not break the seal. She was not permitted to decide what news from her brother might do to her concentration. By the time she left the schoolroom, the household had gone quiet except for the kitchen scullery, where pans met stone in tired rhythm. She paused on the back stair and saw Elsie, the youngest kitchen maid, rubbing her wrists where hot water had reddened them. Chloe went down, took the heavier pan without ceremony, and dried it herself while Elsie stared, uncertain whether gratitude would be interpreted as insolence. "You must sleep," Chloe said. "Tomorrow begins early." "So must you, miss." "Yes," Chloe said. "So must I." In her own room she sat at the window in chemise and petticoat, mending Helena's pearl-grey gloves by candlelight, because the seam at the thumb had split during supper, and the bride had not noticed. The thread was fine enough to vanish if laid with patience. Down in the mews a horse stamped once, then settled. She stitched until her eyes burned, set the gloves beside the ribboned boxes for morning, and lay down without undressing further, one hand over the blanket edge as if still holding herself in place. Morning entered without softness. The maid brought hot water and the day's list from Arabella. Final fitting at Madame Voss's rooms. Church walk-through at 11. Charity calls after luncheon. Seating revisions in the library at 4. Chloe dressed in slate blue muslin that did not wrinkle in carriage travel and pinned her cuffs herself when the maid was summoned away. At breakfast, Helena spoke too quickly and touched nothing but tea. Arabella read 2 letters while eating half a poached egg, then folded one and handed it to Chloe. "Deliver this to the vicar," she said. "The procession order has been amended. You will ensure he understands that my daughter does not wait at the north transept under any circumstance." Chloe accepted the letter. "Yes, ma'am." Arabella buttered toast with measured strokes. "And you will not wander in conversation today. People are inclined to invite confidences from women in your position. Decline." Chloe set her cup down. "As you wish." The carriage to Bond Street smelled of leather and cold air trapped overnight. Helena sat opposite with her veil across her lap, tracing the lace pattern with one finger, as if memorizing a text she might be examined upon. Through the window, London moved in wet grey and polished stone. Shop fronts opening, apprentices sweeping steps, newspaper boys shouting headlines. No one inside this carriage needed to hear directly. At Madame Voss's, the mirrors multiplied everyone and diminished no one by accident. Chloe stood on the dais while a seamstress adjusted Helena's hem, pinned between her lips, and Madame introduced Chloe to a new customer as the practical sister who rescues every schedule. The woman smiled with bright pity. Families are fortunate to have one. Chloe returned the smile that required nothing in reply. From Bond Street, they drove straight to St. James's for the walk-through. The church was cool, echoing, and faintly scented with old wood and extinguished wax. Sunlight fell through high glass in pale bands that did not warm the flagstones. The vicar met them at the chancel step, spectacles low on his nose, and read Arabella's amended instructions twice before nodding that it would be done. Helena practiced the turn at the rail. Arabella corrected the angle of her bouquet. Chloe stood where bridesmaids stood, one pace behind, hands folded, eyes lowered at the proper moments, and raised when a function required. Captain Adrian Vale entered from the vestry with his best man and 2 groomsmen, removed his gloves, and bowed to Arabella with exact courtesy. He wore mourning coat and reserve in equal measure. Nothing in him acknowledged supper or scars or entanglements named for strangers. Yet when the vicar asked where the register pen should be placed after signatures, Adrian answered before anyone else, indicating the left side of the table because ink drips less from that position when the witness stands here. A small, practical correction, the kind made by a man who had stood at that table before. Chloe's pulse struck once against her throat and steadied. The rehearsal proceeded in fragments. Stop at the step. Begin again. Slow the pace. Helena's veil caught on a pew edge, and Chloe freed it without fuss. A flower basket was judged too ornate and sent back to the florist. The organist tested 2 processional pieces while Arabella conferred with Lady Penford about luncheon quantities. Beneath those visible motions, another current moved. Servants receiving contradictory instructions and then discreetly following the ones Adrian gave in passing. A footman carrying trunks toward the north transept changed direction after one quiet sentence from him. A sacristan apologized for a missing kneeler. Adrian thanked him by name and arranged a replacement in less than a minute. Chloe noticed. She had always noticed what others stepped over. At 11:30, Arabella departed for her charity calls with Helena and Lady Penford, leaving Chloe to confirm the revised pew cards with the verger. "Do not be long," Arabella said from the carriage door. "There is still the library chart to finish." When the wheels had gone and the church settled, sound altered. Without the society murmur, the building revealed its actual voice. Distant street traffic muted by stone, a broom against the nave floor, the rustle of pages near the side chapel where someone had left a prayer book open. Chloe moved down the aisle with her list and checked names against pew numbers, crossing out 3 and rewriting 2 in clearer hand. Her pencil left soft grey marks that could be changed without scandal. Ink was final. Pencil was survival. She had just reached the transept when the book slipped from beneath her ledger and fell, spine first, to the floor. The sound cracked sharply in the quiet. She bent, but another hand reached it first. Adrian straightened and held out the prayer book, not looking at the title page, only at the margin where thin graphite lines ran beside the psalms. "You still mark difficult passages in pencil," he said. The words were low, formal, and stripped of display. Not accusation, not apology, recognition. Chloe took the book, their fingers brushing once at the worn leather edge, and answered without lifting her voice. "Some vows require margins." For a moment, neither moved. His eyes were grey in the church light, steady and unreadable, and she saw what the ballroom had concealed: fatigue set deep, restraint practiced to the point of pain, and beneath it, the same attention that had once made a ruined chapel feel like a place where truth might hold. He glanced toward the nave to confirm they were unobserved, then back to her. "I asked for this posting," he said. "I did not ask for this wedding." She felt the words as a pressure behind her ribs. Dangerous because she wanted to believe them. Dangerous because wanting had cost her before. Footsteps sounded near the west door. Adrian stepped back at once, expression shuttered, distance restored with military precision. By the time the verger turned the corner carrying revised hymn sheets, Captain Vale was inspecting the aisle runner as if he had never done anything else in his life. Chloe closed the prayer book over her pencil marks and resumed her list. Line by line, while the disruption she had held at bay all morning settled into certainty. The life she had been forced to inhabit was no longer merely constrained. It had begun to crack. The verger held out the revised hymn sheets, and Chloe accepted them with the same calm she used for invoices and condolence notes, then walked to the front pew to set them in order, while her pulse settled by force rather than inclination. Adrian remained near the aisle runner, speaking with his best man about processional spacing, his voice clipped and practical, nothing in it to suggest that a moment ago he had spoken to her without title, without pretense, as if the years between chapel and ballroom had been a corridor they could still cross. She kept her attention on paper edges, on names written in Arabella's hand, on the vicar's penciled corrections. When she rose, she found Adrian standing a respectful distance away, one glove in his hand, waiting until the verger had moved out of earshot. "Your left cuff is torn," he said. Chloe glanced down. The seam had opened where lace met muslin, likely caught on the pew when Helena's veil had snagged. It was a small, ungainly rip, the kind that marked a woman as inattentive in rooms that forgave men for far greater failures. She folded her hand over the tear. "I shall mend it in the carriage." He held out a folded handkerchief, plain linen, impeccably clean. "Wrap your hand first. You're bleeding." Only then did she feel the sting where the prayer book's brass corner had grazed her knuckle when it fell. A thin line of red had tracked across her finger and dried there, unnoticed. She hesitated, then took the handkerchief and wound it once, precise and temporary. "Thank you, Captain." His mouth shifted by a fraction, not a smile, not quite. "You always refuse help after accepting it. Only when help arrives with commentary." That drew the thing she remembered and had not expected to see again. He smiled. It transformed his face from disciplined reserve to something warmer, younger, briefly unguarded. The expression vanished almost at once as footsteps approached from the side aisle, but the memory of it remained where she could not place it safely. The vicar returned with a clerk, and the room resumed its public shape. Adrian stepped back into his role. Chloe finished checking pew cards, handed over the corrected list, and moved toward the west door. At the threshold, she turned the handkerchief in her palm, saw his initials worked in one corner in dark thread. AF, not AV, and closed her fingers over the letters before anyone else could notice. Outside, the noon light had sharpened. Arabella's carriage waited at the curb, wheels flecked with dry mud from morning calls. Helena sat inside with Lady Penford and a basket of subscription pamphlets for the parish poor, her expression pinned between duty and fatigue. Arabella looked from Chloe's face to her wrapped hand, and then to the church steps where Adrian now stood, speaking with the sexton. "What happened?" "Paper cut," Chloe said, and climbed in before further inquiry could be made. Arabella gave a mild nod, already occupied with the next sequence of obligations. "We are delayed. Lady Penford insisted we add the infirmary stop. Miss Lewis, you will carry the ledger and record pledges accurately this time. Last month, 1 shilling was entered under the wrong widow. It was corrected. It should not have required correction." Chloe placed the parish ledger on her lap and said nothing more. The carriage lurched forward, joining the crowded street where vendors shouted over wheels, and apprentices carried crates between polished doors. Across from her, Helena mouthed an apology she did not dare voice. Chloe answered with the smallest shake of her head. Not now. Not here. At the infirmary, the matron lined donors in order of rank and gratitude. Arabella dispensed coins with serene authority and accepted thanks as if bestowing weather. Chloe wrote each amount, each name, each promised delivery of coal or cloth. A child in the corridor coughed into her mother's sleeve. Helena looked toward them and then back to Arabella, uncertain whether compassion was permitted off schedule. When Arabella turned to speak with the surgeon, Chloe crossed the corridor, gave the child her own wrapped suite from her reticule, and returned to the ledger before anyone could classify the gesture as interference. In the courtyard afterward, rain began without warning, fine and cold. A footman hurried from the carriage stand with cloaks, carrying too many at once, his injured knee buckling on the slick stone. The stack slid. Before the nearest servant could be blamed, Adrian appeared at the gate with 2 officers from his regiment, took the top cloak and steadied the footman by the elbow. "Set them there," he said, indicating the dry bench beneath the awning. "One at a time." The footman flushed and stammered an apology to Arabella. She did not look at him. Adrian did. "No apology required," he said, and moved away as quickly as he had arrived, as if the correction had no significance beyond efficiency. Chloe stepped into the carriage with rain on her sleeves and watched through the blurred glass while he handed his own heavier coat to the same footman, who tried to refuse it twice before obeying. He did not glance toward the carriage. He did not seek acknowledgement. By the time Arabella remarked that Captain Vale possessed an admirable instinct for optics, he was already crossing the street bareheaded in rain. The library at Lewis House smelled of vellum, lemon oil and damp wool drying near the hearth. By 4 o'clock, name cards covered the long table in rigid rows, peers near the front, trade connections at diplomatic distance, elderly relations placed where drafts from the corridor would not stiffen their joints and make them complain audibly. Arabella stood at the table's head and moved cards as if repositioning battalions. "Lord Grantham cannot sit beside the bishop," she said. "They have not spoken since the shipping vote. Move him 2 places right." Chloe moved the card. "Lady Penford must be visible from the entrance." Chloe moved that card too. Helena sat by the fire with her veil in her lap, listening, obedient, and increasingly absent behind the eyes. When she reached for tea, her hand shook just enough to rattle porcelain against saucer. Arabella did not turn. "Control your nerves, Helena. Nervous brides are interpreted as weak-minded." Helena set the cup down with care. "Yes, Mamma." A knock sounded. The butler admitted Adrian and his valet with revised guest confirmations. The valet was older, broad-shouldered, and carried himself with rigid military economy. He stopped 2 paces behind Adrian, then said quietly, "Sir, the War Office rider requested reply by tonight." Arabella looked up sharply. "War Office?" Adrian took the sealed packet from the valet as if it were unremarkable correspondence. "A pension matter concerning one of my former men. It will not disturb tomorrow." Arabella's expression smoothed. "See that it does not." The valet bowed and withdrew. Chloe had seen servants all her life. She knew the difference between deference trained by hierarchy and reflex, forged under command. The man had addressed Adrian as one addressed a superior officer of consequence, not a captain dependent on a mercantile marriage. She wrote 2 amended names onto new cards and kept her face composed. The meeting stretched. Lamps were lit. Arabella sent Helena upstairs to preserve her complexion, then kept Chloe another hour to finalize carriage pairings and receiving line order. Adrian remained ostensibly to confirm military guests, though he spoke little. Twice he corrected Arabella on details she claimed as settled. Once he did so by asking a question so neutral it sounded like agreement. "Mrs. Lewis, shall the parish schoolmistress stand in the second line as listed, or did you prefer to omit her entirely?" Arabella, unwilling to be seen omitting a widow who taught 40 children for near nothing, said coolly, "Second line, naturally." Adrian inclined his head. "As you direct." When Arabella turned away, Chloe saw him shift the schoolmistress card from an obscured corner to the front edge of the table, where no steward could misplace it by accident. The motion was swift, economical, and done without looking at Chloe. She looked anyway. By the second day of wedding preparations, she had started measuring time not by meals, but by these quiet dissonances, what he allowed Arabella to claim, and what he altered once her attention moved elsewhere. That evening, Arabella dispatched Chloe to St. James's again with donation records for the vicar and instructions for floral placement in the side chapel. The church stood in late light, stone turning gold, then grey, as clouds moved across the sun. Inside, a dowager in black silk waited near the nave, leaning on an ebony cane, her profile unmistakable even to those who pretended not to notice rank in old age. Lady Ashbourne, whose invitations determined half a season's social weather, turned as Chloe approached and allowed her gaze to travel from Chloe's plain bonnet to the ledger under her arm. "You are Mrs. Lewis's elder daughter," the dowager said. "Her eldest, my lady." "Not the bride." "No, my lady." Lady Ashbourne's eyes were pale and direct. "I thought not." The west door opened. Adrian entered, removed his hat, and crossed toward them. Before he spoke, the dowager shifted her cane and gave him a bow deeper than etiquette required for a mere captain. It was subtle. Most would have called it stiffness in an old woman's spine. Chloe saw it for what it was and felt the room narrow around the knowledge she did not yet possess. "Captain Vale," the dowager said. "My lady." Lady Ashbourne looked once between them, unreadable, then offered Chloe her gloved hand for leave-taking and moved off down the aisle. Adrian watched until she was beyond earshot. "She does not waste gestures," he said. "Nor mistakes ranks," Chloe replied. A pause stretched, taut but not hostile. He looked at her wrapped knuckle, now freshly bandaged with plain linen from her own room. "You replaced the handkerchief." "I washed and returned it through your valet." He nodded once. "Thank you." She should have left then. The vicar was waiting. Arabella expected promptness. Any additional minute in this church with him invited speculation she could not afford. Yet she remained where she was, ledger pressed lightly against her ribs. "Was your pension matter resolved?" she asked, as if inquiring after weather. "For now." "And tomorrow?" His gaze held hers, steady and guarded at once. "Tomorrow requires accuracy." The answer could have referred to processional order. It could have referred to names in a register, to vows said under public witness, to debts of truth left unpaid too long. She did not ask. He did not explain. They walked together to the vestry door, where the vicar waited, with floral diagrams and a list of hymn numbers. Inside, conversation returned to practicalities: placement of candles, timing of bell ring, whether the aisle runner should be fixed by nail or weighted cord. Adrian argued for weighted cord to spare the church floor from damage, and the sexton agreed with visible relief. Chloe entered her notes, sanded the ink, and handed the page to the vicar for signature. Ordinary motions. Necessary motions. Beneath them, that same dangerous recognition persisted, almost deniable and, therefore, harder to resist. When she stepped back into the evening, the carriage meant to collect her had not arrived. A stable boy stood at the curb, twisting his cap. "Beg pardon, miss. Axle trouble on Brook Street. They sent me to ask if you would wait." The wind had risen, carrying river damp and soot. Chloe drew her shawl tighter and assessed the distance home. Walkable in daylight, less prudent now with the city shifting toward night traffic and tavern noise. She chose the church vestibule and waited on the bench beneath a memorial plaque. Ledger on her lap, spine straight. After several minutes, Adrian came from the side gate, dismissed his own groom, and stopped when he saw her still there. "Your carriage?" "Delayed. I am bound for your district. You may use mine." Mrs. Lewis did not instruct me to alter arrangements. "Mrs. Lewis is not standing in this vestibule with cold hands." There was no heat in the line, only fact. He held her gaze, then added formally, "Miss Lewis, I offer conveyance as a matter of propriety." She considered refusal on principle, acceptance on practicality, and the arithmetic of scandal if seen entering his carriage alone. He seemed to read the calculation and spoke to the beadle sweeping near the door. "Mr. Pike, would you sit opposite Miss Lewis for the journey and attest that she was conveyed directly to Lewis House?" The beadle blinked, then nodded, startled by inclusion in aristocratic logistics. "Yes, sir. Certainly, sir." Again that word. Sir, not captain, not merely courtesy. Chloe rose, gathered her ledger and inclined her head. "Thank you." The carriage was plain black, better sprung than Arabella's with no crest on the panel. Mr. Pike sat opposite, clutching his hat and smelling faintly of polish and old hymnals. Adrian sat beside Chloe but angled toward the window, leaving space between them that could not be mistaken. Street lamps passed in bands of yellow light across his face, and then shadow. Neither spoke until they reached the corner where Lewis House lamps burned behind lace curtains. As the carriage slowed, he said without looking at her, "Do not stand alone tomorrow if you can avoid it." She answered in the same register. "That instruction is impractical." "Most necessary things are." Mr. Pike pretended intense interest in his hat brim. The carriage stopped. Adrian stepped down first, offered his hand as protocol demanded, and released hers the instant she found the step. No lingering, no claim. At the door, the butler took her ledger and announced that Mrs. Lewis required her in the morning room at once. Chloe turned back once towards the carriage. Adrian had already resumed his seat. The door closed. Wheels moved. He was gone into the dark street before she crossed the threshold. In the morning room, Arabella stood by the fire with 3 letters spread on a silver tray and displeasure arranged with mathematical neatness. "You were late," she said. "The carriage axle failed on Brook Street. I returned with a church beadle as witness." Arabella's eyes sharpened at that, then cooled when she saw there was no angle to exploit. "Very well. Tomorrow's breakfast is advanced by half an hour. You will review the register names at dawn. There must be no irregularities." "No irregularities," Chloe repeated. She climbed to her room, set the ledger on the chair, and unpinned her hair in silence. On the washstand lay her mending basket, Helena's gloves now perfectly repaired, beside a scrap of linen she had kept without deciding to keep it. In one corner, dark thread formed 2 letters that did not belong to any life Arabella had approved. A.F. She folded the cloth once and placed it beneath the prayer book where pencil marks waited in the margins, then extinguished the candle and stood in the dark a long moment, listening to the house settle around her and to the quiet, persistent certainty that the pattern was tightening toward a point from which no one in this family would be able to retreat. She stayed in the dark until the last carriage on the street had passed, and the house gave its old timber sigh, then lit the candle once more and opened the register list Arabella had ordered her to review at dawn. Names marched down the page in ranked certainty, each title placed as if precedence could keep ruin from crossing a threshold. Chloe checked every surname against the vicar's copy, corrected one initial, sanded the ink, and set the papers in a straight stack beside her prayer book before lying down in her gown. Sleep came in narrow intervals, never deep enough to soften thought. At first, she was already dressed, hair pinned without maid or mirror, moving through the service passage with a candelabrum and the corrected register pages tied in blue tape. The corridor smelled of yeast, coal, and wet wool drying on hooks by the scullery door. In the breakfast room, footmen were laying silver for the bridal party, and 2 kitchen maids carried a wooden crate stamped with the French mark Arabella prized on formal glassware. Chloe was crossing toward the sideboard when one maid's skirt hem caught on a chair leg. The crate pitched, hit the corner of the marble hearth, and split open with a brittle cascade. Crystal chimed, then shattered. The younger maid, Elsie, went still. Her face drained of colour so quickly it looked painted. A jagged stem rolled in a bright circle at Chloe's feet and stopped against her slipper. Mrs. Hart, the housekeeper, appeared first, keys at her waist, expression already hardened by calculation. "Do not move," she said to Elsie, as if movement might increase the debt. "Do not touch anything." Arabella entered a moment later in morning silk and sapphire, gloves in one hand, the scent of orange water trailing her. She looked at the floor, then at Elsie, then at the clock. "How many?" she asked. Mrs. Hart crouched, counting with swift, trained eyes. 6 goblets, 1 decanter neck, 2 serving stems. The Riverton set, ma'am." Arabella's mouth did not change. "Dismiss her before noon. References withheld. Wages forfeited against the loss." Elsie made a small sound that failed halfway to speech. "Please, ma'am, my brother." Arabella turned to Mrs. Hart as if she had heard only furniture settling. "And remove her from the staff corridor before guests descend." Chloe set the candelabrum down on the nearest table and stepped into the edge of the wreckage where light struck the broken facets like ice. "Charge it to me." Arabella looked at her then, not surprised, merely faintly inconvenienced. "You do not have an account large enough for imported crystal, Chloe." "Then open one." "On what security?" Chloe held her mother's gaze. "Personal property." Arabella gave a short, dismissive breath, less than laughter. "If you mean that pearl clasp and the sapphire drops your aunt left you, they are sentimental trifles. They will not cover French crystal." "Then they will cover part, and I shall cover the rest by reducing my maintenance." Mrs. Hart lowered her eyes to the floor. Elsie stood trembling, hands rigid at her apron seam. Arabella drew on one glove with measured fingers. "You will do no such thing. The household does not reward clumsiness." "It need not reward it. It may refrain from destroying it." The line hung in the room for a single beat, dangerous not for its volume, but for its plainness. Arabella's expression cooled another degree. "You are in no position to instruct me in household governance," she said. "Mrs. Hart, proceed." Chloe bent, lifted one unbroken goblet from among the shards, and set it upright on the sideboard with deliberate care. "Give me 2 hours." Arabella was already turning towards the door. 1. When she was gone, Elsie folded in on herself and began to gather fragments with bare fingers. Chloe caught her wrist before glass could cut skin. "Not with your hands." "I am dismissed." "Not yet." Chloe took the ash shovel from beside the hearth, knelt, and began pushing shards onto the tray. "You will go to the servants' hall. You will drink tea. You will wait." Mrs. Hart watched her in silence, then said in a low voice, "Miss Lewis, this is too large a sum." "I know. There is no guarantee she will relent." Chloe tipped the last bright sliver into the ashpan. "There is no guarantee in refusing either." She rose, handed the tray to a footman, and went upstairs at once. In her room, she pulled her trunk from under the bed and opened the false bottom she had built from hatbox board years ago. A narrow velvet roll lay there beside 2 letters and a dried sprig of rosemary from the field chapel. She did not touch the letters. She unwrapped the clasp and the sapphires, folded them in plain cloth, and closed the trunk without looking back. The jeweller on Bruton Lane opened early for private clients and discreet transactions, his front bell muted by velvet so passers-by would not mark urgency in who entered. By the time Chloe reached the lane, London had turned bright with trade. Carts rattled, apprentices shouted, and rainwater from the previous night still traced narrow, dark lines between cobbles. She gave her name at the side door and asked for valuation, without carriage or servant. The clerk's brows lifted at that, then smoothed when he saw the quality of the stones and old clasp work. "These are old settings," he said, weighing and turning them under the lamp. "Not fashionable." "Nor replaceable," Chloe answered. He tested the clasp spring and named a figure lower than insult and higher than pity. Chloe did not bargain in the style Arabella would have called proper. She asked for a written receipt, immediate payment, and 2 envelopes counted in front of her. One for Mrs. Hart to settle breakage, one for Elsie's next month of wages. "Wages?" the clerk repeated, surprised despite training. "Yes." He hesitated, then counted again with care and sealed both packets in thick paper. "You could keep 1 pair," he said, almost apologetic, "for memory." "Memory does not pay rent," she replied. When she stepped back onto the street, the cloth in her pocket was suddenly light. Too light. She drew one breath, then another, and walked home at a pace that did not invite comment. The clock in the hall showed 8:45. In the service corridor, she found Mrs. Hart at the tally desk and put the first envelope into her hand. "For the Riverton set. If there is a remainder, return it to household reserve under your signature. Mrs. Hart stared at the weight of it, then at Chloe's ears, bare where small sapphires usually caught the light. "You sold them." Chloe nodded once. "Record the source as private effects, not household advance." "And the second?" Chloe crossed to Elsie, who had been standing near the coal scuttle with eyes fixed on the floorboards as if awaiting sentence. She placed the envelope against the girl's apron and folded Elsie's fingers around it. "Your wages for 4 weeks," Chloe said. "You will take this to your aunt in Clerkenwell today. Mrs. Hart will mark you as transferred to outside service, not dismissed for negligence." Elsie's mouth trembled. "Miss, I cannot—" "You can!" Chloe adjusted the girl's cuff where thread had frayed. "You will not thank me in this corridor. You will leave by the Mews gate in 15 minutes and keep your shawl up against the wind." Mrs. Hart cleared her throat softly. "I can arrange a reference to Mrs. Peabody's laundry. They need careful hands." Elsie looked from one woman to the other, then gave a shaky curtsy and pressed the envelope to her chest, as though it might otherwise disappear. Chloe turned to go and found Adrian in the study doorway at the far end of the passage, one hand on the frame, hat and gloves in the other. He had likely entered by the side hall to avoid the formal morning room, and paused at the sound of voices. His face revealed nothing at first. Then his gaze dropped briefly to the unadorned line of her ears and lifted again. "You have settled a matter that was not yours," he said. The corridor had gone still. Mrs. Hart pretended to sort keys. A scullery boy froze with a stack of plates. Chloe answered in the same formal register. "The matter stood in front of me." "That is expensive courage." "Not courage, arithmetic." Something moved in his expression, controlled and unmistakable. Respect, perhaps, sharpened by anger he did not direct at her. He stepped aside from the doorway so Elsie could pass with her bundle, and did not look away until the girl had reached the back stairs. "Mrs. Hart," he said, still watching the stairwell, "see that Miss Barker reaches the mews safely." "Yes, sir." He glanced at Chloe once more, voice lower now. "Keep your receipts." "For what purpose?" "For accuracy," he said, and turned toward the front hall as Arabella's bell rang for the household to assemble. By 10:30, bells from St. James's were testing their ropes, and the upper floors smelled of hot irons and rosewater as dressers moved from room to room. Chloe carried tea on a silver tray to the morning room because Mrs. Hart had been sent to the florist's, and no one else could be trusted, in Arabella's opinion, not to spill cream on legal papers. The tray held 4 cups, sugar in a cut glass bowl, and a thin stack of correspondence tied in green ribbon that Arabella had asked be brought without delay and without witnesses. The morning room door stood nearly closed. As Chloe reached for the handle, voices from inside crossed cleanly through the narrow gap. Mr. Pell, the family solicitor, spoke first, his tone careful in the way of men paid to phrase danger in neutral terms. "Mrs. Lewis, the absence of a record can be challenged if a duplicate is produced." Arabella answered with the flat composure she reserved for financial weather. "The first marriage certificate was destroyed years ago. Once this ceremony is complete, Miss Lewis will be sent to Bath and maintained there. She has always been impressionable." There was a pause, then the solicitor again. "And if she speaks in public?" "She will not." Arabella's chair creaked as she shifted. "Her brother's notes remain in my possession until Monday. She understands leverage when it is explained." The tray tilted. Porcelain slid a fraction and struck against porcelain with a muted click that sounded, to Chloe, louder than any church bell. She caught the edge before it fell, but the sugar bowl lurched, and a sharp lip bit into her gloved palm. Pain flared bright and immediate. Warmth spread beneath kid leather. She did not draw breath sharply. She did not move away from the door. Inside, papers rustled. Mr. Pell said, quieter, "There is also Captain Vale himself. Men at war acquire inconvenient scruples." Arabella gave a brief, dry laugh. "Captain Vale is marrying my daughter. By noon he will have no incentive to indulge Chloe's recollections." Incentive. Recollections. Words arranged like pins. Chloe straightened the tray against her hip and pressed her injured hand beneath the folded napkin, so blood would not mark the silver. She counted once to 3, then opened the door and entered with the calm of a servant who had heard nothing but the clock. Arabella looked up from the escritoire, expression already smoothed for company. Mr. Pell half rose, then sat again when Chloe placed the first cup near him without rattle. The solicitor's eyes dropped, just for a moment, to the darkening seam at her glove. "Tea, ma'am," Chloe said. Arabella accepted her cup and stirred in 2 sugars. "Set the letters here." Chloe laid the green ribbon bundle beside the blotter. A bright dot of red struck the edge of the saucer and disappeared under steam. She adjusted the angle so it faced away from both of them. Mr. Pell cleared his throat. "Miss Lewis, forgive the intrusion on a busy morning." "There is no intrusion, Mr. Pell." Her voice held steady, neither warm nor cold. "Only schedule." Arabella sipped and set the cup down with a soft click. "You may tell Helena the carriages leave in 40 minutes, and send someone to fetch fresh gloves. Yours are soiled." Chloe looked at her mother fully then, the way one might look at a stranger whose language one finally understood in full. She inclined her head. "At once." She turned, carried the lighter tray from the room, and closed the door behind her without haste. In the corridor, out of sight, she set the tray on a side table and removed the glove. Blood had pooled in the palm and tracked along the lifeline in a narrow red curve. The skin beneath was cut, but clean. She wrapped the hand with Adrian's returned handkerchief, white linen tightening over the sting, and stood very still while voices from the morning room resumed in calm, administrative tones. When she lifted her head, her reflection in the corridor glass looked exactly as Arabella required: composed, orderly, useful. Only her eyes had changed. They were no longer searching for permission. She rinsed the blood from her palm in the schoolroom basin, watching pink water spiral down porcelain, then dried her hand on a linen towel and retied the bandage with a firmness that made the sting clean and clarifying. Voices moved through the house in widening circles now. Dressers upstairs, footmen in the hall, the butler announcing arrivals in the drawing room with ceremonial precision. The wedding machinery had begun to turn. If she waited for a quieter hour, there would be none. She crossed to Arabella's secondary desk, unlocked the top drawer with the key she had memorized years ago, and removed Thomas's promissory notes from beneath the household insurance schedules. The papers were soft at the folds from repeated handling, ink browned where signatures had dried too quickly under poor light. She did not pause over them. She folded them once and placed them inside her bodice, near enough that she could feel each breath against the edges. Then she knelt beside her bed, drew out the trunk, and opened the false bottom. The velvet roll lay where she had left it, now empty of stones. Beside it rested 2 letters and the weathered duplicate marriage certificate, the parish seal pressed deep and uneven into old wax. Adrian's former name sat beside hers in careful vicar's hand, and for the first time in 3 years she did not look away from it. Legal, binding, erased only if she allowed erasure to stand. She slid the certificate into her prayer book, wrapped both in a plain shawl, and packed one small bag: a chemise, stockings, her brother's last unopened letter, the receipt from Bruton Lane, and nothing else. A knock came before she could close the trunk. Helena entered without waiting, veil lifted in one hand, cheeks bright from powder and nerves. "They said Mama sent you for my second gloves," Helena said, then stopped at the sight of the open bag on the bed. "Are you leaving?" Chloe closed the clasp and rose. "I am moving my things from this room." "Today?" "Yes." Helena's gaze shifted to Chloe's bandaged hand. "You are hurt." "Only cut." Helena set the veil down and stepped closer, dropping her voice. "If this is about breakfast," Mama was severe with everyone. "She does not mean half of what she says on ceremony days." Chloe looked at her sister, young, frightened, dressed for a life selected by others and told it was choice, and reached to straighten the lace at Helena's shoulder where one stitch had pulled. "She means enough," Chloe said. Helena swallowed. "Do you dislike him so very much?" The question came from a place too raw for strategy. Chloe answered it with the only mercy she had left. "I do not dislike your happiness," she said. "Remember that. Whatever is said later." Footsteps sounded in the passage. Helena drew herself up, bride again, and took the second pair of gloves Chloe handed her from the chair. "Do not be absent at the church," she whispered at the door. "I cannot walk if you are not there." "I shall be there," Chloe said, and it was the last promise she could safely make. She waited until Helena's steps faded, then took her bag and prayer book and went to the service stair. In the lower hall she found Mrs. Hart carrying seating cards and stopped long enough to place the Bruton Lane receipt and a short note into the housekeeper's hand. "If I am delayed, this accounts for the crystal payment," Chloe said. Mrs. Hart read the first line, looked up sharply, and lowered her voice. "Miss Lewis, what are you doing?" "What should have been done earlier." "Mrs. Lewis will dismiss me if I conceal it." "Then do not conceal it. Record it." Chloe adjusted the strap of her bag. "Only record it accurately." Mrs. Hart held her gaze for one beat, then tucked the paper into her ledger. God keep you, miss. By the time the church bells shifted from testing to full peal, Chloe had reached St. James's through the side lane, her hem marked with damp from the stones, and her breath steady despite the pace. The west doors stood open to receiving lines and white ribbons. Guests moved toward their pews in layered silk and dark coats, carrying perfume, starch, wet wool, and the thin metallic scent of anticipation. She passed through the vestry corridor unannounced, left her bag on the register room chair, and stepped into position near the chancel rail with her bouquet and bandaged hand hidden beneath the stems. The ceremony began in proper sequence. Organ, procession, murmur folding into hush. Helena reached the altar on her father's arm with that fragile composure brides are praised for and rarely protected within. Adrian stood opposite in mourning black, shoulders square, expression disciplined to neutrality. When his gaze found Chloe at Helena's left, it held for the briefest moment and moved on, but she saw recognition tighten through him like drawn wire. He had noticed the bandage. He had noticed the bag no attendant had carried. The vicar opened the prayer book and began the familiar lines. Arabella sat in the front pew, sapphire fixed at her throat like a seal on an official document, eyes cool and assured. Mr. Pell sat 2 places behind her with his gloves folded over one knee. Lady Ashbourne occupied the aisle seat near the front and watched everything. When the vicar asked who gave this woman, Helena's father answered. When guests shifted for a better view, silk whispered over wood. When the vows approached, Chloe set down her bouquet, stepped away from her place and walked forward before anyone could intercept movement with etiquette. She did not raise her voice. She did not hurry. She crossed to the altar table, laid her prayer book on the linen cloth, and opened it to the weathered certificate with hands that no longer trembled. Reverend Clark, she said, clear enough to carry through the nave, before new vows are spoken, I request that you read the names on this document aloud. The organist's hand froze above the keys. A collective intake of breath travelled the pews and held. Arabella rose half an inch, then sat back down with visible force. Composure fighting calculation. The vicar blinked behind his spectacles. Miss Lewis, this is highly irregular. So is bigamy, Chloe replied. No one moved. The word did what shouting could not, stripped decoration from the room and left only structure. Reverend Clark took the document because refusing it would have been public refusal of evidence, and his office did not permit that luxury. He broke the old fold carefully, read, and went pale beneath his collar. Where did you obtain this? It is the duplicate issued on the day of registration, Chloe said. Please read the names. Arabella stood now. This is an hysterical interruption. My daughter is overtired and impressionable, as I warned you she might be. Chloe turned her head toward the pew without taking a step back. Sit down, mother. 4 words, flat and final. Arabella's mouth hardened. You will not address me so in church. I just did. Reverend Clark looked from the certificate to Adrian, then back to the page, trapped between protocol and legal duty. Mr. Pell had gone very still, eyes fixed on the lower margin where signatures rested. Helena stared at Chloe as if the floor had shifted under her feet, but she had not yet been told whether to run or stand. The vicar swallowed. His voice, when it came, sounded older than it had 10 minutes earlier. Recorded at St. Bartholomew Field Chapel, this 17th day of May, witnessed by Samuel Price and Edwin Holt. Bride, Chloe Ann Lewis. Groom, Adrian Fairfax, signing at that time as Adrian Vale. Certificate of lawful marriage entered and duplicated according to parish practice. Silence followed with physical weight. In the second row, someone dropped a fan. It snapped against the stone and was not retrieved. Chloe kept her hands on the altar cloth because she needed the texture, linen ridge, carved edge beneath, to remain exactly in her body and not vanish into the noise that would come. Arabella found her voice first, controlled and cold. "Captain Vale, you see what malice can construct from old paper. Say what is necessary." Adrian did not look at Arabella. He stepped away from Helena, crossed the single pace that had remained between himself and Chloe since the ceremony began, and stopped beside her. Up close, she could see the pulse at his throat, rapid but contained. When he spoke, his tone was quiet enough that the church leaned in to hear. "My name is not Captain Adrian Vale. I am Adrian Fairfax, Marquess of Rothermere." He held the hush for one measured breath and added, "Chloe Lewis is my lawful wife, and she has always been the only one." The words did not arrive like thunder. They arrived like a lock turning in a door everyone had pretended was decorative. In one stroke, the initials on linen, Lady Ashbourne's deeper bow, the War Office rider, the valet's reflexive sir, the authority hidden beneath deference. Each detail reordered itself into coherence. What Chloe had catalogued as inconsistency was structure. What she had feared was abandonment had, at least in part, been concealment under siege. Helena made a small sound and gripped the edge of her veil with both hands, then lowered herself to the nearest chair before her knees failed her publicly. Lady Ashbourne rose, crossed without asking leave, and stood at Helena's shoulder with one gloved hand lightly on the girl's back, steadying without claiming. Mr. Pell closed his eyes briefly, as a man does when an argument he hoped to avoid has arrived in its final form. Arabella remained standing, face drained not of colour, but of assumption. "Marquess," she said at last, the title clipped by disbelief. "You misstate yourself in a moment of confusion." Adrian turned then, and the shift in the room was immediate. He had been careful until now to inhabit smaller rank. He stopped doing so. "I do not misstate," he said. "You forged correspondence, suppressed parish record, and coerced silence by holding debt instruments over Miss Lewis's brother. The instruments are no longer in your possession." Arabella's eyes flashed to Chloe's bodice, to the bandaged hand, to the altar where the certificate lay open. For the first time in Chloe's life, her mother looked not angry but uncertain. From the vestibule came the measured tread of new arrivals, not guests, hard souls, official cadence, a pause as the verger spoke in a lowered voice and was answered by another. Chloe did not turn yet. She kept her eyes on the register page and on Adrian beside her, close enough that she could feel his sleeve brush hers when he breathed. He did not touch her hand. He did not speak over her. He simply stood at her pace while the church, and everyone in it, recalculated the meaning of her name. From the vestibule came the measured tread of new arrivals, not guests, hard souls, official cadence. A pause as the verger spoke in a lowered voice and was answered by another. Chloe did not turn yet. She kept her eyes on the register page and on Adrian beside her, close enough that she could feel his sleeve brush hers when he breathed. "Reverend Clerk," said a man's voice from the nave entrance. "Forgive the interruption. Magistrate Ellison, Westminster Bench." The congregation parted by instinct more than courtesy. The magistrate entered with a clerk carrying a leather folio and two constables who halted at the aisle edge. Behind them came a dark-coated solicitor Chloe recognised from Arabella's table only by reputation, Mr. Harrow of Lincoln's Inn, and, unexpectedly, Mrs. Hart, pale but upright, with her housekeeping ledger clutched to her chest as if it were scripture. Arabella recovered first. "This is a private family ceremony." "It was," Magistrate Ellison said, accepting a sealed paper from his clerk and breaking it before speaking again. It ceased to be private when allegations of coercion, fraudulent trust handling, and suppression of parish records were sworn before the bench this morning. He looked toward Chloe with professional neutrality. Miss Lewis, do you submit the document currently on the altar as evidence? I do. Reverend Clark passed him the weathered duplicate with both hands. Ellison examined seal, signatures, and date, then handed it to his clerk, who compared it against a second copy from Mr. Harrow's folio. The scratch of pen on paper sounded indecently loud in the hushed church. Arabella's voice came cool and clipped. My daughter has been manipulated by a man who has already admitted concealment. Adrian turned toward the magistrate, not toward Arabella. I concealed title for reasons I will state under oath. I did not conceal marriage from Mrs. Lewis. She concealed it from the church and attempted to compel a second ceremony by financial leverage against Mrs. Lewis's brother. Chloe reached beneath her bodice and drew out Thomas's promissory notes, edges creased from her body heat. She stepped to the magistrate and placed them on the open folio. These were held as leverage. They are now out of her possession. Ellison scanned the signatures and nodded to his clerk. Mr. Pell, still in the second row, rose halfway as if pulled by a string, and then stood fully when Ellison addressed him. Mr. Pell, as solicitor of record to Mrs. Lewis, do you contest these instruments? Pell's mouth opened, closed, then settled into the expression of a man selecting the least fatal truth. No, sir. They are genuine notes, and I was instructed to draft correspondence implying Miss Lewis had no prior legal attachment. He looked once at Arabella and then away. I advised against destruction of records. I was overruled. Arabella's face did not crack, but the room's belief in her did. It fell away in small, audible shifts. A chair leg dragged on stone, a cough cut short, someone whispering, "Good God," behind a glove. Helena stood at the rail with her veil loosened in one hand, not weeping, not speaking, just staring at the altar linen where Chloe's prayer book lay open like an accusation no one could fold closed. Lady Ashbourne moved to her without ceremony, set that steady gloved hand at Helena's back, and addressed Reverend Clark. The bride is blameless, she said. Record it plainly. I shall, the vicar answered, voice roughened by strain. Magistrate Ellison refolded the warrant and looked directly at Arabella. Mrs. Arabella Lewis, you are required to accompany these officers for formal examination. You may retain counsel. You may not remove papers from your residence pending inventory. Arabella drew herself taller. You are enjoying this vulgar spectacle, all of you. No, ma'am, Ellison said, only ending it. The constables stepped forward. Arabella did not resist. She handed her gloves to Mr. Pell as if passing him opera tickets, then looked at Chloe with a flat, exhausted contempt that had ruled a household for years, and suddenly ruled nothing. You have ruined your sister. Chloe met her gaze and answered in the same measured register. No, I refuse to ruin myself. Arabella held that look one heartbeat longer, then turned and walked down the aisle between pews of people who had once leaned toward her approval. No one reached to stop her. No one bowed. When the vestibule doors closed behind the magistrate and officers, the sound echoed through the nave and left a vacuum in its wake. Reverend Clark removed his spectacles, wiped them, replaced them, and spoke to the room. This ceremony cannot proceed. Miss Helena Lewis bears no fault. I ask all present to depart in dignity and with restraint. Guests obeyed because clergy gave permission for what gossip would otherwise devour. Lady Penford gathered two matrons and flanked Helena like a screen, guiding her toward the vestry before the first speculative whisper could strike her full force. Lady Ashbourne paused near Chloe on her way past. "I bowed as I did because I recognized him," she said quietly, eyes pale and unsparing. "I did not speak because he asked for one day to bring legal proof instead of rumour. That day was today." She inclined her head, lower now to Chloe than rank required. "You were misnamed in this city. Not any more." Then she moved on, cane tapping stone in even beats. "In the vestry corridor, mister." Harrow opened his folio and handed Chloe a folded legal packet tied in red tape. "Order of release filed at 10 this morning," he said. "Your brother's notes are discharged under Marquess of Rothermere settlement and entered with the court. Creditors are barred from collection." Chloe took the packet with fingers that had finally begun to shake, now that the danger had already passed. "And Thomas?" a familiar voice answered from the side door. "Here." Thomas looked thinner than when she had last seen him. Coat brushed to respectability, but cuffs worn. Hair cut too quickly by a barber paid in haste. He crossed the corridor in 3 strides and stopped short of embracing her until she gave the smallest nod. Then he held her carefully, mindful of her bandaged hand. "I sent letters," he said against her temple. "Mama told me you were too occupied to read them. I have the last one unopened." Chloe stepped back and touched his sleeve as if proving he was material and not consequence. "You are free," he gave a short, unbelieving laugh. "For the first time in a year." She removed the final letter from her small bag, still sealed. "Then keep this. It belongs to the man who wrote it, not the woman who was prevented from reading it." Thomas took it and slipped it into his inner pocket. "I'll read it tonight, with proper whiskey, to honour my own folly." A breath of dry humour touched her mouth and vanished. "One glass. You are still my brother." Across the corridor, Helena stood just inside the vestry door, veil now removed, face bare of bridal arrangement and somehow older for it. She looked from Thomas to Chloe to Adrian, who had remained a step back, giving the siblings their space. "Did you know from the beginning?" Helena asked Chloe. "No." Helena nodded once, absorbing pain in controlled increments. "Then I shall not hate you for speaking." "I would have understood if you did." Helena's mouth trembled but held. "I do not hate truth. I hate being handled." She turned to Adrian. "My lord, if that is your style, we have both escaped disaster." Adrian bowed with grave sincerity. "Miss Lewis, you deserved honesty before ceremony. I regret that you did not receive it sooner." "So do I." Helena drew in a breath and straightened her shoulders. "Still, I am 19. Society forgives 19 if one faints attractively and says nothing. I do not intend to faint, but I shall say very little." She looked back to Chloe. "Come to me tomorrow if you wish, without Mamma." "I will." Helena crossed the threshold to Lady Penford's waiting arm and did not look back again. An hour later, when the church had emptied and the bells were silent, Chloe stood in the register room where, years ago, she had been entered and then erased. The room smelled of dust, ink, damp stone, and the faint starch of freshly laundered linen. Her one packed bag sat on a chair beside the wall. Her prayer book lay closed beside it, the certificate now logged by the clerk and copied into formal record. Reverend Clark set the parish register on the table and turned it toward her. A new notation had been written in careful black ink beneath the original entry. Identity of groom corrected by affidavit, marriage affirmed valid, attempted second ceremony voided by law. Space waited for signatures. "Mrs. Fairfax," the vicar said, then paused as if testing the rightness of the name. "If you please." Chloe took the pen. Her injured palm protested when she curled her fingers, but the line she wrote was steady. Chloe Ann Fairfax. She added the date without blotting. Thomas signed as witness, jaw set with a pride he did not hide. Reverend Clark countersigned and sanded the ink. Adrian had remained at her right, silent unless asked. Now he spoke, low and even. "There is one matter I should answer before you ask it." She set down the pen and looked at him fully. "Then answer." The War Office packet was confirmation that Sergeant Samuel Price still lived and could attest the chapel marriage under oath. I asked for his statement before I moved against your mother. I would not ask you to stand on memory alone. She held his gaze, sorting anger, relief, and the stubborn ache of years spent doubting what had once been clear. "You still allowed this morning to reach the altar?" "Yes." No defense in the word, only fact. "If I moved sooner without documents, she would have buried you in accusations of invention. I chose proof over speed. It cost you another hour of humiliation." "I know." Chloe breathed once, feeling the cut in her hand, the weight gone from her ears where sapphires had been, the absence of fear where fear had lived too long. "Do not choose for me again, without warning." "I will not." It was not a plea. It was a vow in plain clothes. She lifted her bag from the chair. He reached as if to take it, then stopped, waiting. She gave it to him because she wished to, not because she was expected to. He carried it without comment and opened the register room door. In the passage beyond, light from the west windows lay in long rectangles across worn stone. Thomas had gone ahead to settle papers with Mr. Harrow. Reverend Clark closed the register with both hands and bowed them out. At the church threshold, Chloe paused and looked back once at the room where she had been written small, and then written out. The door stood open now. Adrian waited beside her, not touching, not urging. "Ready?" he asked. She looked at the street, at the waiting carriage with no crest displayed, at the city that had called her practical because it had no better category for a woman who endured without spectacle. Something steadier than endurance settled in her chest. "Yes," she said. They descended the church steps together, matching pace, and this time no one asked her to walk behind.